You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. I don't talk in real life about having hoarding disorder, so I talk about it on this podcast instead. And because I'm anonymous, I can talk really, really honestly. Subscribe to the podcast and find my social media links, episode transcripts, and every link that I mention at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. So I am here with Dr Jan Eppingstall, a counsellor in Melbourne, Australia, who I can't legally say is the world leading hoarding expert, but she does a pretty good job.
Please, no one tell Randy Frost there'll be issues.
Jan, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. I'm very well.
Can you tell I didn't plan that intro?
No.
So we are starting today with a new occasional segment called Permission Slip.
Do you need a permission slip?
In which I tell Jan about an item I am inexplicably having trouble getting rid of, and Jan gives me permission to get rid of it. Or she doesn't. She says, no, you should definitely keep that. And while we're doing this, you think about if there's anything along those lines that you feel like you need permission with. So, Jan, let me show you this and I will describe it for listeners. It is a piece of black plastic, long, thin black plastic. And when I got my printer last year, which sits on top of the previous broken printer.
So it's a stand. It's okay. It's purposeful. Yep.
The printer had this in the packet.
Right.
And I have never been able to work out where in the printer it's meant to go. I've tried a few places and it just seems to get in the way. So I have used this printer for the best part of a year without ever involving this piece of black plastic. And yet I feel a compulsion to keep it just in case the use for it suddenly becomes clear.
The completion, wanting to keep everything complete and being obsessed with making sure that all those things are together, even though chances are it will break and you'll still have that black plastic item that will never, ever be used. You have my permission. You have my permission to let go of that.
Thank you.
You haven't needed it.
I don't even know why I would need it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And if you are listening and you have something in mind, I give you permission to get rid of it, Jan?
Yeah, I give you permission. Just go for it.
So today, Jan and I are talking about self-stigma. When I did the interview with Jennifer Kraft about stigma, I also kept coming across references to self-stigma. So I wanted to look at that in more detail. Jan, what is self-stigma and how does it differ from the stigma we might be more used to hearing about?
Okay, so the type of stigma that we usually are talking about is public stigma. So this relates to society's negative reactions towards particular subgroups. Now, before we kind of talk about self-stigma, I'd kind of like to go down a little bit of a small rabbit hole.
Love it.
Regarding public stigma, because I kind of feel it informs our understanding of self-stigma.
Yeah.
But public stigma is kind of made up of three elements. Stereotypes, which are shared beliefs about groups, generalising the characteristics of the members and not looking at the differences between individuals. So, like, for example, the mentally ill are dangerous and incompetent is a stereotype. The second element is prejudice, which is negative emotional valuations about that subgroup. And for mental illness, that's often fear, anger, pity, those types of emotions. And then discrimination, which is negative group-based behaviour against a group, like withdrawing help, not hiring a person because they have a mental illness, rejecting them as potential partners, or social distancing from them when you're in the street, walking around them. That kind of thing is there's many types of discrimination, but those are kind of some of the things. So unsurprisingly, mental illness is more stigmatised than physical disabilities because we often need to see physical proof of someone's capacity. And when we look at the content of mental illness stereotypes, they correlate with specific emotional and behavioural action tendencies. And they kind of distill down to these two fundamental dimensions of society's perceptions of the groups. So there's these two emotional kind of elements, which are warmth and competence. So warmth, kind of low warmth, high warmth, relates to the intention of the group member, of the stigmatized group member, and competence relates to whether they're considered low competent or incompetent, or they are highly competent, all kind of high status. So I guess the perceived worth, contributions, and capacity of the group. So what's interesting is that there's 4 types of these combinations of warmth and competency. So high warmth, low competency are people like older people or people with a disability, and they elicit feelings of pity and sympathy from us. Then there's low warmth, high competence, which are rich people and feminists, funnily enough, in the research. That's one of the that popped up. I was like, and we feel envy and jealousy for their status. I'm not quite sure. Maybe they should have said rich white men instead of just rich people. I don't know. But that idea that they're cold-hearted, but they're competent. Then high warmth, high competence. This is like our in-group. So this is whoever we kind of relate to. The middle class, usually the Joneses, we feel admiration and pride because we relate to them. But finally, we have the low warmth, low competence. And this is where people who are homeless, people with mental illnesses, which is often the same, a part of the same group, they actually provoke disgust and anger.
And like a lot of those combinations, like high warmth and low competence, can mean that somebody is treated nicely, but it's incredibly patronising.
Patronising, exactly.
And underestimated. And so it's all about, few of those combinations are great in terms of how people are perceived, basically.
Exactly. I mean, the whole high warmth, high competence, that's your... that's your Joe Blow, whoever lives next door to you or whatever, you tend to see those because you know them and you've actually had interactions with them.
Yeah, and that's why, like, somebody who's racist in general might say to someone, oh, not like you, to a black friend, like, you're different.
You're all right. I mean, it's the others that I don't like. Exactly. And a more recent conceptualisation suggests that there's a couple of things that kind of are included in public stigma, which is difference. They aren't like me, which we were just talking about. Disdain, they're bad, and blame, they're the ones who it's blame. These are kind of key facets of public stigma too.
I found the disdain, blame, and what's the other one? Difference fascinating.
Me too.
When I was doing when I was reading about that in researching this episode, it really helped me to put my finger on where prejudice can lie, I think.
Exactly. I mean, interestingly, within mental illness, stereotypes vary by disorder.
Of course, yeah.
So, for example, schizophrenia and DID, dissociative identity disorder, or addictions are kind of seen as especially low warmth and low competence, and therefore especially disgusting, I mean, hoarding stereotypes are what? Lazy, crazy, and filthy. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, there's not a great deal of research at this point, but that is where public stigma sits. So self-stigma or internalised stigma is us taking the negative stereotypes from a society, the society that is widely endorsed that refers to our group and applying it to ourselves. So it becomes our self-talk and our self-concept. It's really about having those thoughts, taking on those ideas that our culture often kind of layers over us, the stereotypes that we believe that are true.
Yeah. And there's a lot of interlinking between public stigma, self-stigma, shame. All of this stuff is very tied together.
Mm.
What would you say are the differences, if any, between self-stigma versus self-consciousness versus self-blame, that kind of thing? How do they interact?
Yeah, so self-consciousness is being aware of yourself and your appearance or actions. So everyone's looking at me and judging, which, I'm putting up my hand because I'm always worried about what other people are thinking. And they're always worried about what other people are thinking. So no one's worried about
what you look like in the supermarket. Yeah.
Self-blame or self-censure is when we attribute the occurrences of something traumatic or stressful. We attribute that to ourselves. I caused that. It's my fault. And self-stigma, as we said, is the acceptance of negative attitudes of society. We need to accept them first, recognise that they're there, accept them, and then apply those to ourselves. I'm worthless, disgusting, hopeless, because that's the kind of stereotype of my label. Whatever I feel I've been labelled with, that's how I'm viewed by everybody that I meet.
And self-stigma isn't just about, the problem with it isn't just that it makes you feel bad.
Mm.
There was a study by Rachel M. Prosser and colleagues who summarised that for self-stigma to occur, there must be awareness of stigmatising beliefs, agreement with these, and application to oneself. This may then lead to harm through low self-esteem, hopelessness, and discriminating behaviours against themselves. And it also, and I speak from experience, does prevent people from seeking help. And Leslie Gale wrote a PhD dissertation that says the field of community psychology views stigma and self-stigma as social constructs that can undermine intentions of treatment. And then another study by Claire Murphy-Morgan and colleagues says self-stigma is associated with reduced willingness to engage with treatment, difficulties trusting others without feeling judged, with negative impact on help-seeking behaviours. So all of that is to say that this isn't just about it makes you feel sad.
No. I mean, the biggest one is that unwillingness to reach out for support because, rejection's anticipated. And if we believe the stereotypes, then of course we'll expect rejection because it makes sense. People think hoarders are lazy, crazy and filthy. I'm a hoarder. I'm all of those things. Ergo, I will be rejected. So why try? I'm not worth help. All of those sorts of...
I will be rejected, and rightly so.
Yeah, and rightly so, because look at me. That they'd be right to do that. And not being able to trust anyone to help because of a fear of judgment and misunderstanding of our needs and wants. So even if we do engage in treatment, we're so overwhelmed and hypervigilant that we can't receive the full benefits because our nervous system's completely either shut down completely or on a high alert.
And backing up what you just said, there was a paper by Victoria Edwards and colleagues about how stigma can be a factor in the reduced social support that people who hoard can experience. We've talked a lot before about a lot of people who hoard are very isolated and lonely.
Mm.
And the PhD by Gale said people living with mental illness may learn to anticipate the rejection of others, which is exactly what you just said. It just all causes a whole mess of problems, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it does mean keeping secrets. Isolating yourself and therefore loneliness because heck, if I'm judging myself this way, imagine how someone else will judge me. And it really does lead people to just basically their lives start to shrink. And that's what I see working with clients is that things just start to, the anxiety of these various things, keeping secrets, it just shrinks their lives and they wake up one day and find their home is maybe just, or their space of their living space is just one small area.
One chair, one sofa, that's it. Yeah.
One chair, exactly.
I've been thinking a lot and reading a lot about who is stigmatized and who isn't. On a recent episode, I reviewed a film called Where Dragons Live, which was about some adult children dealing with their parents' home after they died. And even though the film wasn't about hoarding, there were a lot of themes in it that spoke to me about hoarding. But there was something I said in the episode along the lines of, the parents weren't hoarders, they just had an awful lot of stuff, but they had a huge house with lots of nooks and crannies to keep it in. And I've questioned myself about that statement since I made it. Like, would I have said they weren't hoarders if they weren't incredibly well off, for instance? And when I spoke to Luna Dolezal in the episode about shame, we spoke about how people may be more susceptible to struggling with shame if they're already marginalised and shamed for other aspects of their identity on top of hoarding or a similarly stigmatised problem. Then I read a paper by Afifa Bharti about the judgments people make about hoarders depending on how they're portrayed in TV shows, which is fascinating. And how the judgments and the portrayals depended on their socioeconomic status, so how well off they were, essentially. So, here comes the question eventually. If some people are more stigmatised by others than other people are, might this impact how much we self-stigmatise as well? So if somebody is subject to a lot of external stigma, might they be more susceptible to self-stigma? I've got a favour to ask that could make a big difference. If you've been enjoying the podcast and want to support it, here are some ways you could do it. Consider making a donation. Every pound helps me keep the podcast running. Alternatively, show some love by leaving a review. Your words really mean a lot to me and they help others to discover the podcast. And do spread the word. Share the episodes with anyone who might benefit from listening. Whether it's a donation, a review, or just sharing, your support keeps me going. Find out more at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support.
I think it would definitely be a factor that would increase the likelihood of them self-stigmatizing. I mean, the impact of public stigma, it separates you from your community. You're less likely to reach out. Isolation then reduces your self-esteem and trust of others. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. But I think the conversation about, socioeconomic status and hoarding and how that's perceived. I mean, if the stuff's good, in inverted commas, if it's designer clothing, antiques, art, and therefore valuable in a monetary sense, the person has room to store it and manage it and stuff, and then they can employ people. Is that still hoarding? Like, I've grappled with that a lot. And I kind of say yes if they have the cognitions and behaviours that meet the criteria, but it's the issue of distress and impediment to doing kind of the everyday stuff that makes it a disorder. So if they have more room and storage, it's not impacting them or others physically, is it?
Yeah. Whereas if they were exactly the same person with exactly the same, keeping exactly the same things, but living in a one-bedroom flat, how is that? It's fascinating, isn't it? How is that different?
It is.
I watched the Celine Dion documentary about her illness on Amazon Prime.
Oh, yeah.
It's very interesting and it's pretty heartbreaking. Like, I've never especially been a Celine Dion fan, but you can't ignore her impact on music over the last 20 years. And she's now in this place where singing is incredibly hard and unpredictable. And what I got from it was that she kind of doesn't know who she is when she can't sing. But there's a scene there's a couple where she's in this giant warehouse that just contains all of her costumes from her various, she's been in the industry a long time. And she'll like go to a particular dress and she can tell you exactly how they came up with the design and exactly what it felt like to be fitted and exactly why this was like that and why this was like that. But she has the means to store these things and she holds the same kind of memories and associations that a person who hoards might as well. Like pick something up and go, oh, I wore this when this and it felt tight on my waist and so I had to, it was fascinating. But she's incredibly rich and has a warehouse to store them in that's temperature controlled and all of that. Yeah.
Humidity controlled. Exactly. I mean, I saw a doco about an actor. I can't think who she was. She was in all the tabloids because she descended into hoarding and clutter. According to their kind of judgments, she had these mountains and mountains of clothes kind of piled high in disorganized piles, and they had photos of it in one of those trashy mags. But I kind of had the sense that depression and maybe addiction had impacted her ability to kind of manage her whole life. And maybe, when she was earning money, it wasn't a problem. But when the jobs stopped coming, she was anxious and going, well, all of this stuff's worth money. Maybe, and it's just leveling, isn't it? It's just leveling. Everybody has the same kind of, yeah. It's just degrees and extent.
I think this thinking around, are you a hoarder if you have enough space?
Yeah.
Are you a hoarder if your stuff is objectively valuable? Is a fascinating one.
Yeah.
It's usually Jan that commissions someone to do a PhD, but this week I'm going to commission someone to do a PhD on that.
Yes, I do usually send people off to sort out those questions that we've got. But yes, I think that would be very, very interesting because you've got people like Andy Warhol. He was the scoop and dump king. He would just scoop and dump everything off his desk, including, chewing gum and whatever, pop it into a box, archive it, and you can go and view his scoop and dump boxes.
It's interesting that because he's important, people, I wouldn't say encourage it, but want to see that and see value in that. Whereas if you're a nurse and a single mom and I don't think people think that's valuable, and I do think where that line is fascinating.
Yes, and it's very blurry, I think, in some cases. Infamous or famous, I don't know.
Yeah. So I grew up Catholic, and Catholic guilt is not a myth.
No. Exactly.
I think because of growing up Catholic, I'm especially susceptible to an instant understanding of anything and everything being my fault and being something wrong at my very core. In Catholicism, that's not done by halves. Like, it goes deep into who you are. And that is really instilled from birth. And, obviously, there's all kinds of things that influence that, societal, all that kind of stuff. So what other social factors impact how much we self-stigmatize, would you say?
I think there's definitely evidence to suggest that the level of public or group stigma in a particular culture really influences self-stigmatization. Like mental illness in Japan is stigmatized way more than in Australia. And some religions have very strong beliefs about what the source of mental illness is. And some believe it's, lack of grit or weakness or even demonic possession. There's all these kinds of ideas that come into play. But risk factors for self-stigma include the severity of the behaviours, how stigmatized, as I said, the disorder is in the culture, the attitudes and belief of the culture, and the actual individual around psychological treatment, which is one that I feel is really important to note, because some countries, some cultures, receiving treatment is acceptable. In others, it's not, but also in some subgroups within cultures. it's acceptable, in others it's not.
Yes. I think middle-class white women can go to therapy, and that's a self-enriching thing to do. And I think a poor Asian woman, it's indulgent, or it's weird, or it's,
Yeah, why can't you just sort it out yourself, kind of thing. How aware the person is of the stereotypes in their culture as well, whether they've actually been exposed to those, and then actually having experienced prejudice and discrimination in the past. All of those things are going to impact how much we self-stigmatize. But there are some protective factors. And this is interesting because this ties into what we were saying before. One of those is the quality of your life, which indicates that socioeconomic status is key, because that quality of life measure that they use includes material and physical well-being, relationships, social, community and civic participation, personal development and fulfillment, and recreation. All the things. If you have no money or connections or other factors, you can't engage in that. So that's not a protective factor that will assist you. Social relationships that you have can protect. Level of social functioning, again, neurotypical versus neurodiverse. There's a whole layer there. And again, how accepting your culture is of your particular mental illness. Because I know that there's been some research around particular cultures having more somatic, psychosomatic sort of disorders.
Yes, so you feel it in your body, yes.
Yeah, rather than, more cognitive things. So I think there's something to be said about that. But the risk factors and the protective factors do seem to tip to the side of those who are socioeconomically advantaged.
And as you were talking about the way communities view mental illness, I thought of a story, and it will involve me being that awful, ignorant white person saying somewhere in Africa, because it's a long time since I heard the story, so I can't remember where. But talking about a particular area where if somebody is struggling with mental illness, the community comes together and says, where did we go wrong? What are we doing wrong as a community that has enabled this person to get this unwell? And so I feel like I try on the podcast and in conversations with you before to, at least to some degree, look structurally at things as well as individually. Like, especially when we talked about homelessness, for instance, that there are, there's individual responsibilities, but there has to be a structural look at things too. And so as you were talking, I was also thinking that if community looks at in that kind of where are we all going wrong as a community, that this has happened to this person.
Yes.
That, I imagine, could reduce self-stigma significantly.
I think so, because then you're over understanding, being heard, being seen as an individual, rather than just avoiding that person, ignoring that person, walking across the street.
Banishing them even, yeah.
Banishing them, yeah, exactly. So I do think that is something, if we were a more enlightened society, then perhaps that would be the route we would take. But unfortunately, we got
a way to go.
We've got a long way to go. We do.
And even when we point out that there are societal and structural and all those kind of factors that are involved in any kind of mental illness, including hoarding, that's not to say there's no, we also are responsible for our own behaviour and action. How do we maintain that line between, on the one hand, being accountable and responsible for what we do, and on the other, not despising and stigmatizing ourselves for the problems we or those around us are facing because of our hoarding?
It can be really difficult because accepting, taking accountability can slide, very quickly into, berating yourself about how did I get here? And this is so shameful. And I can't believe I let this happen is what I commonly hear from people. And I think it's not necessarily about stopping those thoughts as much as it is recognizing that the thought is just a thought. It doesn't mean that you're really, you're despicable and dirty and horrible. It popped up, and recognizing that, acknowledging that, I think.
Yeah, hi, there's a thing. I don't know if I necessarily agree with it, but I'm acknowledging it's there, and I'm going to carry on as I was.
Yeah. And we do have to be responsible. It's like, well, my actions, my behaviors that I repeated over a period of time have resulted in this. It's not a blame game. It's more recognizing that's what happened and reverse engineering that to work out, well, what were the emotions? What that led to the behaviors. What was I thinking at the time? What was going on in my life? And taking responsibility for those actions and behaviors, but also recognizing that maybe that was the best you could do at the time. And now you're able to do more. Now you're able to thank your mind, thank Gloria or whatever you call her. I don't know. I call mine Gloria. Just, thanks for that. I know you're trying to help.
And what's it trying to tell me beyond you're useless?
It's usually trying to protect you, to be honest. It's often trying to protect you from failure, saying, oh, yeah, you're disgusting, really. And, you've tried before and remember what happened? I don't want you to be hurt again by failure. I'll just keep telling you that you can't do it because then you won't fail and feel disappointed. Most of the time it's trying to protect you. It's not right. It's not, a rule to be followed, but it can derail people because they really live in that space where they listen to what their brain is telling them, their mind is telling them.
So one paper I read, and as always, I link to, I list every paper we talk about in the show notes. So was by Jennifer Kraft, former guest, who was talking about...
Shout out, Jen. Shout out to Jen.
Shout out to Jen. I nearly went into shout out to my ex.
Oh.
I don't know if I know any of the rest of the words.
I don't know. I don't know that song. So.
Anyway, this paper by Jennifer Kraft and Clarissa Ong talked about using acceptance and commitment therapy, which for new listeners is the kind of therapy Jan works in, to work on self-stigma. And in a separate paper, Jennifer Kraft again said ACT appears to help address self-stigma and its emphasis on values clarification and flexible attention could theoretically help address motivation and inattention in hoarding. So how would you, as an ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy therapist, go about working on self-stigma with a client?
I think first, which Jennifer mentions, I would ascertain personal values. I'd really focus in on what's important and how the person wants to live their life. That is step one. Then I would probably focus on some psychoeducation of relational frame theory. That's the foundation of ACT. We did a whole podcast on that, so I'm sure you'll link to that. But it's how language allows us to do so many amazing things which have advanced our society, but when we apply them to our emotions, they create suffering. So stereotypes are this mental shortcut. We use them to make quick decisions about the way people are likely to behave. That's the benefit of a stereotype. In relation to public stigma, we compare ourselves to that stereotype and kind of form these beliefs about ourselves. I was thinking about this when I was kind of contemplating how various clients have reacted to watching those shows. Some of them will compare themselves to the TV show and believe they're nothing like them at all. There's just no way that they are that bad, in inverted commas, when perhaps they've got slightly rose-tinted glasses because, they collect something completely different. And this person collects one thing, they collect something else, and they can use the toilet, so they can't possibly be, that bad. Others might make the comparison that are not factual and believe they're beyond help and are just like the people on the show. And then that leading to kind of learned helplessness that, oh, well, these people really struggled and I watched them and it was painful for me to watch them. And it will be equally painful for me to go through that, which I find is one of the problems with people watching this type of show. It would be my focus to kind of look at working with the person to diffuse, as I was explaining before, from these comparisons as well. Looking at the stereotype, comparing myself to the stereotype, looking at the TV shows, comparing what I'm collecting or how I'm living with those people, and kind of help them practice diffusion when their self-talk turns to self-stigma, accepting the thoughts, thanking their mind, moving forward, regardless towards those values. Really, that's kind of the core of ACT, and it does allow people to get some separation, some distance between stimulus and response, which is what we're attempting to do. We want that space so that we can observe what we're thinking and take action in the direction of our values, not just towards that thought. That's the key.
And what about other types of therapy? Are there other effective approaches that might be able to help self-stigma? I enjoy making this podcast and it helps me on a personal level. It's a lot of work, but the feedback I get makes it worthwhile. I fund everything about the podcast myself. So if you want to help to ensure the future of the podcast, you can help me to cover the costs by sending a one-off or recurring donation at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/donate.
Perhaps cognitive behavioural therapy techniques like reframing might work. Empowering people to bring others together in a peer support group like you're doing can help significantly to allow a person to see that the stereotype is just that it's a generalisation about a group of people. It's not individual experience. Everyone's different. Everyone has a right to be heard and understood. I think that's what the peer support group can really do for someone with hoarding. Maybe radical acceptance could be useful, like a dialectical behavioural therapy technique, which is a 10-step kind of process where, you observe that you're questioning or fighting reality. It shouldn't be this way. And if you've really self-stigmatized, you're going to think it shouldn't be this way and it's my fault and I'm dirty and filthy and crazy and all of those things. The reality, remind yourself that the unpleasant reality is just as it is and it can't be changed. This is what happened. No judgment, no berating yourself. It is what it is. Right. The reason, remind yourself that there are causes for the reality, how it happened, all of those factors that you're thinking about that were physical or psychological reasons that possibly catapulted this into an unexpected overflow of stuff. This is how things happened. And then practicing accepting your whole self, mind, body, spirit, and using more accepting self-talk, relaxation techniques, mindfulness or imagery. And there's a bunch of other steps, but I think it's about looking at what behaviours you would engage in if you did accept the facts and then engage in those behaviours as if you've already accepted them. Like, what would I do if I could move forward and then just move forward? Pretend that you've accepted it. I think, radical acceptance is just about saying, I accept that this is the reality. This is where I am. And that allows you to then move forward. It can be very powerful. A lot of people hear acceptance and they think giving up. They think
This is how it is.
Well, this is how it is. I can't do anything. I can't. But it's more about not fighting with the reality, because we often do fight with, again, many of my clients perseverate on what has happened. And, it's kind of my role to sort of bring them into the now, this moment, because it's already over. This moment is already over. The next moment is about to happen. We're in the moment now. Those things were in the past. It's happened. And the other point I often make is we need to focus on the living in our lives, because many of my clients have a lot of grief around loss. And it may not be people, but it might be pets. It might be, maybe there was a fire and they've lost a lot of things. We need to be thinking about the living, ourselves and our family members who are here now, not those that have passed, because I think they would be disappointed to think that you were so anxiously considering whether you should let go of something rather than living your life.
Absolutely. So I think one of the important things we have identified in that whole conversation is that if you're affected by self-stigma, trying to say no thank you to it isn't necessarily going to work. Whereas acknowledging its existence, maybe looking at why you think that, maybe looking at would I judge somebody else if, can be really helpful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Would I treat a friend this way? Would I treat a fellow peer group member this way? No.
Yeah.
It's always no.
That's it. And also that different people are affected by self-stigma in different ways and to different degrees, but that can depend on everything from your personality to your upbringing to the society you're living in. I look at my stats for podcast downloads, and there are some places that are quite predictable and there are some places that surprise me every time. So to the 3 listeners in Lithuania, this, maybe an entirely different, you may be hearing this entirely differently to the 200 in Brazil, to the several thousand in America, based on the society you live in. And if you live in, say, your parents migrated somewhere and you're in that kind of dual society thing, then there's more layers still.
Yes.
So understanding it in part of the way I feel about this is based on my makeup, the makeup of my brain and my personality. Part of it is influenced by all of these things. But if I recognize that it's not a helpful way to think of myself, but that banishing it isn't necessarily the goal is to say, there's that thought again. What's that trying to tell me? What can I do? What can I do differently?
Exactly. It's looking at it rather than pushing it down. Yes.
So, Jan, if people want to find you online, where can they do? I feel like I could record you doing this bit.
Why? I love it so.
Where can people find you online?
Online. They could pop on over to Instagram at stuff_ology, or X. I'm a bit slack on X, but at stuff_ology. Pinterest. Hey, I've been told that my Pinterest boards are very aesthetically pleasing. Some of them have been up there for 10 years. So please explore at stuff_ology. And on Facebook, Stuffology Consulting. But check out the website, stuffology.com.au. Sign up for the newsletter, which I send out once a week on a Sunday night, my time. And drop me a line, Jan at stuffology.com. I'd love to hear from you.
Can I just correct your email address there?
What did I just say?
Jan at stuffology.com.
Why? What did I say?
You just said
.com.
Yeah.
Did I? .com.au. Jan at stuffology.com.au.
So thank you, Jan. As always, that's been really interesting and given me a lot to think about.
Excellent. Thank you for having me yet again. Ciao for now. May we take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record and listen to this podcast today. I am speaking on the lands of the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their connection to country, both land and sea, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today.
Shout out this week to the Help Whole podcast. Have a listen to this little clip of Sophie Hagen on the Help Whole podcast. And they are talking about a book about flirting. But if you set aside the flirting content and think about the overall message, I think it's really interesting. Have a listen.
I read it on Kindle, so most of these were you could see when other people have underlined something.
Oh, wow.
Because they found it helpful. And I was like, oh, these are all underlined. This has been really helpful for people. It's just really nice things like when you allow your self-worth to be influenced by strangers, don't be surprised when it doesn't go the way you want. Using someone else as a means to help you feel good about yourself just reinforces your fear. It perpetuates a negative cycle in which you become more dependent on the positive affirmation of others, which in turn strengthens your fear of rejection. It's essentially don't make other people's opinions about yourself matter. Like if you go up to someone and however you flirt, if what is underlying is you saying, hi, please make me feel pretty, you're just like giving them a power and then you are dependent on them. And that's like not a good idea.
We do put a lot of emphasis and judgment on what other people think of us, don't we? And what we are looking for when we get feedback from another person. And we do need to really learn to find that within ourselves as much as we can. I will link to the Help Whole podcast in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Okay, thank you for listening. And I'll speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to that Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast.
We pause for 1 second. I apologise. I have pet troubles. Off you go, Gretel. Go. I've got to let you go. You've got to get out because this is too much. It's a menagerie in here.
Is it really a Zoom call if a cat doesn't walk by? That's
I think you're right. I don't think there's any, or a baby or a child going, hey, yeah, I mean, cognitive behavioural therapy techniques like reframing, not reflaming, sorry. Reframing. No, reframing. Although I have bought stuffology.au, but I haven't set it up. That's irrelevant information.
Good to know.
No one needs to know otherwise. Oh my God. I don't know why I said
and
that.
I was about to go, well, you could just auto forward it. And then I was like, oh, shut up.
Shut up.
Nobody cares.
We care. We all care. We care. We care a lot. Sorry.